Smothered liver and onions on a Wednesday, neck bones so tender the meat slid off before you touched it, pound cake resting on the table while the oven still held heat. The 1970s. Those kitchens went quiet. Here are 30 nostalgic 1970s soul food recipes for black seniors who miss the old days. Salmon croquettes were the Friday night constant in black kitchens across the South and every city the Great Migration touched. A can of pink salmon, bones left in and crushed into the mix for calcium, a trick passed down without ever hearing the word nutrition. The salmon was flaked with a fork, folded with cracker crumbs, egg, diced onion, and black pepper. Some cooks added hot sauce, others stirred in yellow mustard, and that difference was the line between one family's recipe and another's. The patties hit a cast iron skillet of shimmering Crisco, and the sizzle was the dinner bell. You heard it from the porch. Golden and crisp outside, warm and soft in the center, they came with grits or white rice. You could follow the recipe exactly today, but without her standing over that skillet in her housecoat, flipping them with a fork she never washed between batches, they will never taste the same. Smothered chicken with onion gravy turned the cheapest parts of the bird into something that made grown men go quiet at the table. In the 1970s, whole chickens cost less than $1 a pound, and your mother stretched one across Sunday dinner and Monday lunch. She seasoned thighs and legs with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, dredged them in flour, and browned them in cast iron until the crust went deep gold. The chicken came out. Thick sliced onions went in, sizzling in the drippings until they collapsed into something sweet. Flour went back into the fat, stirred fast, then broth hit the pan in a rush of steam that fogged the windows. The chicken returned, the lid came down, and the whole thing simmered an hour until the meat slid off the bone. Spooned over white rice, the gravy soaked through every grain. You knew it was done when the smell changed from sharp to deep and round. Only the person at the stove could read that moment. Before the rest of the house stirred, there was tomato gravy simmering on the back burner, and you could smell the bacon fat cutting through the sharpness of canned tomatoes from under your blanket. The dish needed nothing expensive, just drippings saved in the coffee can by the stove, a tablespoon of flour stirred until it browned, and a can of stewed tomatoes crushed by hand into the skillet. A pinch of sugar took the acid down. The gravy was poured thick over white rice and eaten with a spoon, sometimes alongside fried eggs or salt pork. It came from Depression-era black kitchens where one can of tomatoes fed a household of 8, and it traveled north to Detroit and Chicago inside the memories of women who never stopped cooking it. Through the 70s, it held on as a weekday standard, the kind nobody wrote down. You made it the way your mother showed you, and if you asked for measurements, she would shake her head and say, "Pour until it looks right." Monday meant pinto beans in every black kitchen that remembered the South, and the ritual started the night before, sorting dry beans on a table, picking out the stones, leaving them to soak in cold water overnight. By morning, they were swollen. Your mother set them on a low flame with a ham hock, quartered onion, garlic, and water to cover by 2 inches. The pot stayed there all day. Monday was wash day. In New Orleans, red beans and rice on Monday was law, and beans could simmer unwatched while laundry got done on the board or hauled to the laundromat. By evening, they had broken into a thick, creamy broth that clung to cornbread. A bowl cost almost nothing and fed everyone. The woman who seasoned them knew the salt went in late because adding it early toughened the skins. She carried that timing in her hands. When she stopped cooking, Mondays never tasted the same. If beans simmered all day on one burner, the other belonged to whatever the garden gave. And in late summer, nothing came sweeter than fried corn cut straight off the cob. Your grandmother held each ear upright in a wide bowl, ran a sharp knife down the rows, then went back with the dull side of the blade and scraped hard. That scraping was everything. It pulled the milky starch inside each row, and that liquid turned fried corn creamy without a drop of cream. The kernels went into bacon grease, always bacon grease, never butter, because butter burned too fast, and cooked low, stirring constantly until the corn thickened and clung to the spoon. Salt, black pepper. Some cooks added sugar if the corn was starchy, but the old women said if you needed sugar, you picked it too late. It tasted like August, hot, golden, and gone before you were ready. Stewed tomatoes and okra carried a lineage stretching back to West Africa, where okra, brought to the Americas inside the hulls of slave ships, had thickened soups and stews for centuries. In black kitchens of the 1970s, it cost pennies and fed the spirit like a feast. Fresh okra was sliced into rounds and fried first in a hot skillet until the slime cooked off and the edges crisped. That step separated the cooks who knew from the ones who did not. Canned tomatoes went in next, crushed with a wooden spoon, along with onion, garlic, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The pot simmered until the okra was tender and the tomatoes had thickened into a sauce that was tangy, savory, and rich. Served over rice, it was a full meal. Served alongside fried fish, it was a celebration. The women who grew that okra in their backyard plots knew exactly which pods to pick, no longer than a finger, because anything bigger turned woody. That knowledge came from watching, not reading. In the 1970s, pig ear sandwiches were sold at juke joints, neighborhood bars, and roadside stands across the Black South, and the people who ate them did not apologize. The ears were cleaned, boiled for hours until the cartilage softened, then sliced thin and either pickled in spiced vinegar or deep fried until the edges went crisp. Served on white bread with hot sauce, mustard, and dill pickles. The sandwich had a texture nothing else matched. Crunchy where the fat rendered, tender where the meat pulled apart, tangy from the vinegar. The dish came from the nose to tail tradition that had fed black families since slavery, when the ears, feet, and tails were the only cuts passed down to the quarters. At places like the original Cozy Corner in Memphis or nameless stands in the Mississippi Delta, a pig ear sandwich and a cold drink was Saturday night. Today, those stands are mostly gone. The ears are still cheap, but the hands that slow cooked them have moved on. She kept them in a bag in the freezer, yellow and curled, and when you were young, they frightened you. But your grandmother saw something in chicken feet the grocery store did not. Collagen, gelatin, a broth so rich it set like jelly when it cooled. The feet were scrubbed, outer skin peeled after a blanch, nails clipped with kitchen shears, into the pot with onion, celery, garlic, and bay leaves. Hours later, the liquor had turned golden and thick, the feet broken down until tiny bones pulled from tender meat. In the Caribbean and across West Africa, chicken foot soup was healing food, given to the sick and the newly delivered mother. Black families in the South carried that belief into the 1970s. When supermarkets replaced corner butcher shops, the stew disappeared from most kitchens. The women who made it swore the broth could fix anything. They are gone now. Nobody has found a replacement. Dirty rice earned its name from how it looked, flecked brown and gray from chopped chicken livers and gizzards stirred through every grain, and anyone from a Louisiana kitchen knew the dish by sight before they tasted it. The livers were sautéed fast until firm but still pink, then chopped fine alongside gizzards, simmered tender for an hour. The Holy Trinity, onion, celery, bell pepper, went in next, diced small and cooked in rendered fat until soft. Cooked rice was folded in with green onion, garlic, cayenne, and a splash of Worcestershire nobody measured. By the 70s, dirty rice showed up at reunions, holiday tables, and Friday suppers alongside fried fish. It was never the centerpiece and did not need to be. It made everything else on the plate make sense, and the cook who got the seasoning right never had to ask if people liked it. The empty pot answered. Plain cornbread was the daily bread. Crackling cornbread was the Sunday version. Cracklings folded into the batter, nuggets of rendered pork skin that added salt, fat, and a crunch you heard across the table. The cracklings came from hog killing day, when fat was rendered in a wash pot outdoors, and the solids left behind were pressed, salted, and sealed in lard jars. A handful went into the mix: stone ground yellow cornmeal, egg, buttermilk, a pinch of soda, and enough bacon drippings to grease the skillet until it smoked. The batter hit screaming hot iron, and the bottom crust formed instantly, golden, almost caramelized. You ate it hot, split with butter, or crumbled into potlikker. The sound of breaking a wedge was specific, a clean snap followed by a soft crumble, and if it did not make that sound, the skillet was not hot enough when the batter went in. That kind of detail only the women who baked it 3 times a week ever carried. Long before that iron cooled, the jars were lining the counter, mason jars of Chow, the pickled relish that sat on every table and topped everything from beans to fish. Making it was a late summer project. Green tomatoes that would not ripen before frost, the last cabbage heads, bell peppers going soft, all chopped fine, salted overnight, drained, and packed into jars with hot vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric that turned the batch gold. In black households across the Carolinas and Virginia, chow was as essential as salt. Some families made it sweet, others loaded it with cayenne until a spoonful burned your eyes. The recipe was the grandmother's, guarded not on paper, but in proportions only she could measure by sight. When the last jar was sealed, she lined them up and counted. If the count was right, the supply lasted until next summer. Too few, and the family felt it by February. Those jars held the whole garden, and the woman who put them there. Turkey, wings were the working family's answer to a roast nobody could afford on a Tuesday. In the 1970s, turkey parts sold for less than chicken, and a pack of wings fed 4 for under $2. Seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and smoked paprika, the wings were seared until the skin blistered, then braised in a deep pan with sliced onions and gravy built from drippings, flour, broth, Worcestershire, bay leaf. 2 hours at 325, and they came out falling apart, the meat pulling from bone in long shreds, the gravy dark as coffee. Served over rice with greens, the plate looked like it cost 10 times what it did. That transformation, cheap to grand, ordinary to Sunday worthy, was the genius of black home cooking. Your aunt made them every holiday. She said the secret was the sear, burning the skin at the edge on purpose. After she passed, 3 cousins tried. None got the gravy dark enough. Every kitchen had one, a glass, bottle, usually an old hot sauce jar or a repurposed vinegar bottle filled with tiny bird peppers, steeping in white vinegar until the liquid turned pale orange and the heat settled in deep. Pepper sauce was never bought. It was made. Your grandmother dropped fresh peppers from her garden into that bottle every summer, topped it off with vinegar, and let it sit on the table year-round beside the salt, pepper, and hot sauce. You shook it over greens, over beans, over rice, a few drops at a time, because the vinegar carried more fire than it looked. Through the 70s, that bottle was a household signature. Each household sauce tasted different depending on the peppers grown, how long they steeped, and whether the cook added garlic or a pinch of sugar to round the edges. When your grandmother passed, somebody kept her cast iron, somebody kept her mixing bowls, nobody thought to save that pepper bottle. Nothing from the store has ever come close to what was inside it. Time equals 1 second / greater than the smell of pork chops. Frying on a Saturday could pull you in from 3 houses down. Thin bone-in chops seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, dredged in flour, fried in Crisco until the crust turned dark gold and the edges curled crisp. The sandwich was simple. 1 chop laid flat on soft white bread, hit with hot sauce or mustard, topped with another slice, wrapped tight in wax paper. You ate it with your hands, the bread soaking up grease until it went translucent but never fell apart. Back then, fried pork chop sandwiches traveled to work in lunch pails, on road trips in paper bags, to the park where the grill was for show, but the real food came from the kitchen. Your father ate them cold at midnight, standing at the counter. Your mother made a dozen at a time. The chops cost less than $1 for a whole pack. The bread cost $0.25. The meal held a family together on nothing, and it tasted like everything. Now, if the pork chop sandwich was Saturday, sardines on saltines was the meal nobody planned and everybody remembered. A flat tin packed in mustard or oil, pulled open with the key attached to the can, laid out on crackers with sliced raw onion and a shake of Louisiana hot sauce. That was supper between paydays, the nights when the refrigerator held condiments and hope. Your grandfather ate them standing at the counter without a plate, cracker in one hand, sardine balanced on top. He did not call it poor, he called it quick. In black households through the 1970s, canned sardines were a pantry constant, cheap, protein-rich, and shelf-stable for months. On Fridays, in homes that observed the no-meat tradition, sardines replaced pork without complaint. Kids wrinkled their noses at the smell. Adults knew better. The taste was salty, briny, sharp with mustard, and gone in 5 minutes. There was no recipe, just a tin, some crackers, and a man who fed himself without fuss. The greens got all the glory, but the real treasure was the liquid left behind. Potlikker, the dark smoky broth at the bottom of every pot of collards, mustard greens, or turnip greens that had simmered for hours with a ham hock or a piece of fatback. It was not a byproduct, it was the point. Rich with vitamins, minerals, and rendered pork fat, potlikker was sipped from a coffee cup, poured over rice, or soaked up with crackling bread until the bread went soft and heavy with flavor. In the 1940s and 50s, doctors in black communities quietly recommended it for anemia and exhaustion, iron from the greens, fat for energy, salt for the body after a long day of labor. It was medicine dressed as leftovers. The women who made it never poured potlikker down the drain. That would have been like throwing away money. They saved it in jars, reheated it the next morning, and gave it to children before school with a piece of cornbread. You would not find it on any menu, but it kept people standing. Stewed chicken appeared when company showed up unannounced, and your mother had to stretch one bird across 8 plates without letting anyone see the math. A whole chicken went into the pot with water, onion, celery, garlic, salt, and pepper, simmered until the meat fell from the bone. She pulled it out, stripped every scrap, dark meat, white meat, the little pieces tucked behind the thigh, nobody names, and returned it all to the broth. Flour mixed with water thickened the liquid into gravy. Over white rice, 1 chicken became a meal for a full table. That was the trick she never admitted, making less look like plenty. The cousins who dropped by always said, "Girl, you cook too much." She smiled and said nothing. The pot was scraped clean by evening, and everyone took that as proof of a big meal rather than a small one. She took that secret with her. The sizzle of thick-cut bologna hitting a hot skillet was the sound of childhood in the 1970s, and if you grew up in a black household between paychecks, you know exactly what that sizzle meant. The bologna was sliced thick, not the paper-thin deli cut, but a solid 1/4 inch from the big roll at the meat counter, and scored with a knife so it would not cup up and burn unevenly. Into the dry skillet it went, no oil needed because the fat in the meat did the work, browning the edges until they crisped and the center puffed slightly from the heat. Laid on soft white bread with yellow mustard or mayonnaise, a slice of American cheese if there was any, and eaten at the kitchen table or carried outside to the stoop. That was lunch. That was dinner. That was the Tuesday between grocery runs when the freezer was empty and the creativity was full. Your father made them for you without being asked. He did not call it cooking. He just handed you the plate and sat down. If you did not grow up in a household that made Chitterling loaf, you have probably never heard of it, and that is why the people who remember it hold on so tightly. This was not the same as a steaming pot of chitlins on New Year's Day. Chitterling loaf was the cold version. Intestines boiled for hours, seasoned with vinegar, red pepper flakes, sage, and salt, then pressed into a loaf pan and waited until the natural gelatin set the whole thing solid. Sliced thin like cold cuts, it was served on bread or crackers with more vinegar and hot sauce. The texture was firm, slightly chewy, with a tang that hit the back of your throat. In the Carolinas and parts of Georgia, Chitterling loaf was a fixture at church homecomings where the older women still made it from memory. By the 1980s, the dish had nearly vanished. Younger generations never learned the pressing technique, and without the right hands, the loaf would not hold. It slipped away quietly, the way things do when the only people who knew how stopped showing up. If the Chitterling loaf belonged to the older women, the garden belonged to everybody, and nothing from that garden carried more summer pride than a mess of Crowder peas picked fresh with the snaps still on. Crowder peas were not black-eyed peas. They were darker, earthier, and they stained the Potlikker a deep purple brown. The snaps, tender young pods picked before the peas matured, went in whole, adding green brightness that dried peas never matched. Shelled on the porch in the evening, the work was shared between grandmothers, mothers, and children, and the rhythm of thumbs splitting pods was the soundtrack of July. Cooked with a ham hock, seasoned with salt and pepper and nothing else, Crowder peas with snaps lasted only as long as the garden produced. When the season ended, so did the peas. Today, you can find dried Crowder peas in some stores, but the snaps are gone and the porches are quieter. Thanksgiving was not about the turkey, it was about the gravy, and the gravy belonged to whoever held the giblet bag. Inside that small pouch tucked into the bird's cavity sat the liver, heart, gizzard, and neck, and in black households, those parts did not get discarded. They were boiled with onion and celery until the neck meat fell off the bone and the organs could be chopped fine. The giblets went into pan drippings, thickened with flour and stretched with broth until the gravy turned dark and rich, flecked with tiny pieces of liver and heart that gave it a depth no plain drippings could match. Ladled over cornbread dressing, it was the soul of the holiday plate. The woman who made it was usually the eldest in the kitchen, and she did not share the stove. She tasted with her own spoon. She adjusted the salt without asking. When she passed the duty down, it meant she trusted your hands. In some families, that handoff never happened. The gravy just stopped being right. Chicken foot stew might raise eyebrows today, but in black kitchens of the 1970s, it was beloved comfort food made from parts others threw away. The feet were scrubbed clean, blanched to remove the outer skin, then simmered until they released natural gelatin into the broth. This created body and richness that regular chicken pieces could not achieve. Potatoes, carrots, and onions joined the pot, soaking up that deeply savory liquid. Some cooks added hot peppers for warmth that went beyond temperature. The stew was valued during winter illnesses when families believed its collagen-rich broth could heal what ailed you. Children sometimes balked at the appearance, but one taste usually converted them. The feet were free or nearly so, making this stew an act of pure kitchen wisdom, taking what was dismissed and creating nourishment. Fresh ground cornmeal from local mills gave 1970s cornbread a texture and flavor that commercial products have completely lost. Small mills throughout the South ground corn to order, producing meal with the germ and oils intact, giving it sweetness and depth that degerminated versions lack. This cornmeal was alive with flavor, requiring refrigeration because its natural oils would turn rancid. Cornbread made from fresh meal had crumbly richness, golden color, and taste that made it more than just a side dish. Families knew which mills produced the best meal and would drive miles to get it, understanding that this single ingredient determined quality. As small mills closed and mass production took over, cornmeal became standardized, stripped of character for shelf life. The cornbread that once anchored soul food meals became ordinary. In the churches, where everybody brought a dish and nobody signed up for the same thing twice, ground beef cornbread pie disappeared first. Seasoned beef, browned with onion, sometimes green pepper, always garlic, spread across the bottom of a greased cast iron skillet, topped with a layer of canned corn, then a blanket of cornbread batter poured right over everything, baked until the top was golden and the edges bubbled where the meat juices seeped through the batter. The women who made it for the repast after a funeral knew it traveled well, held its temperature, and fed mourners without requiring plates that needed washing. A dozen different women could make it, and no two versions tasted alike, which was part of the charm. It cost almost nothing and comforted the way only cornbread and beef together can. Warm without being showy, filling without being fussy. The smell of hamburger gravy meant it was the end of the month. You knew before you walked into the kitchen. Flour browning in hot fat, the sharp hit of black pepper, the soft thud of a wooden spoon against cast iron. Your mother browned a half-pound of ground beef, crumbled it fine, left every drop of grease in the pan, sprinkled flour over the top, and stirred until it turned golden. Milk went in slow, and she kept stirring until the whole thing thickened into a pale brown blanket that clung to the spoon. Poured over split buttermilk biscuits, it was dinner. The dish had roots in the military, where servicemen called it SOS, but in black kitchens, it was simply gravy and biscuits. No pretense, a full meal for 4 people on less than 70 cents. Nobody called it struggle food, not once, because when it was made right, it tasted like being taken care of. And the woman who made it would never tell you she skipped her own plate so there was enough for everyone else. Saturday mornings had their own rhythm. It was the last thing she ate before bed and the first thing she offered when you could not sleep. Cold cornbread crumbled into a tall glass of sweet milk, stirred once with a spoon, eaten in the quiet kitchen with no light but the one above the stove. There was no recipe because there was nothing to measure. Cornbread from supper, milk from the icebox, a spoon, a glass, a chair. In the 1950s and 60s, cornbread and milk was a common meal across the rural Black South, eaten by field workers, by children before school, by old men on porches after sundown. The cornbread softened until it was halfway between solid and soup, sweet from the milk and gritty from the cornmeal. so plain and complete that nothing needed adding. Your grandmother ate it in silence. You sat across from her and did the same. That silence held every meal she ever made, every kitchen she stood in, every hand that taught her hands. You finished the glass, she washed it, the kitchen went dark. That is the taste you will carry longest. Cold cornbread, sweet milk, and the woman who gave you both without being asked.
Cowpea fritters were a dish that came straight out of resilience and memory, with roots reaching back to African cooking traditions. Families would soak and mash dried cowpeas, mix them with a little onion, cornmeal, and seasoning, then fry the mixture in hot lard until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They were cheap, filling, and carried the rich protein that many households could not always get from meat. For Black families in the South, cowpeas were already a staple crop, so using them to create something hearty made perfect sense. These fritters could be eaten plain or dipped in gravy, and they were often made in batches large enough to last a day or two. They carried a deep sense of history, because this kind of cooking showed how old world techniques adapted to the realities of hard times in America. They were not only nourishment, but also a connection to ancestors who had relied on the same beans for strength. Baked rice pudding with raisins was a dessert that came together from what was already in the kitchen, making it a perfect example of soul food thrift and ingenuity. Leftover rice was never thrown away. Instead, it was mixed with milk, eggs, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, then baked slowly until it set into a creamy custard. Raisins added bursts of sweetness, plumping up as they absorbed the milk and spice. This pudding often marked the end of Sunday dinner, or was made on special occasions when the house filled with the scent of vanilla and baked sugar. Served warm or chilled, it carried the taste of comfort and resourcefulness, especially during times when store-bought desserts were too costly. Every cook had their own variation, some adding a touch of lemon zest or a sprinkle of nutmeg on top for extra flavor. It was a dish that could be enjoyed over several days, growing richer as the flavors melded in the refrigerator. While boxed pudding mixes replaced many homemade versions over the years, nothing matches the texture or taste of rice pudding baked slowly in the oven, with raisins scattered like little treasures throughout. Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze turned weekend gatherings into sweet, smoky celebrations in African-American neighborhoods across the 1970s. Meaty pork ribs were marinated in apple cider, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar, then slow roasted or charcoal grilled until the meat was fall-apart tender. Midway through cooking, the ribs were brushed with a thick cider glaze that caramelized over the heat, creating a sticky surface that clung to every finger. The scent of roasting pork and sweet apples drifted across backyards, drawing neighbors and cousins long before dinner was served. Served with potato salad, baked beans, or simple white bread, the dish balanced tang and richness perfectly. It was both a nod to Southern barbecue traditions and a chance to add a fruity twist that felt fresh for the decade. Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze embodied the joy of family cookouts, where music played late into the evening and every plate carried the flavor of smoke, sweetness, and laughter shared outdoors. Collard green Potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of Potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Cabbage and salt pork stew was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed a crowd without stretching the budget. The cabbage would be chopped and simmered slowly with chunks of salt pork, which released their fat and smoky flavor into the pot. The result was tender, silky cabbage leaves bathed in a savory broth with just the right touch of salt. In many homes, this dish was a weeknight regular, not because it was flashy, but because it was filling, dependable, and used ingredients that were always on hand. Served alongside cornbread or over a small scoop of rice, it could transform the simplest table into a satisfying meal. This stew also carried the comforting smell of something cooking low and slow, the kind of aroma that filled the whole house and made everyone hungry before it was even served. It was the food of patience, where the flavors had time to come together without rush. Supermarkets today offer pre-shredded cabbage and processed pork products, but they cannot recreate the texture and taste of the old, home-cooked version. For those who grew up with it, cabbage and salt pork stew was proof that thrift and flavor could live in the same pot. Cowpeas and rice, pilaf, offered a taste of Carolina heritage that African American families carried forward with pride during the 1970s. Dried cowpeas soaked overnight were simmered gently with smoked turkey wings or a ham hock until tender, releasing a broth rich with earthy flavor. Long grain rice was added to the pot, soaking up the seasoned liquid and transforming the dish into a complete meal. Onions, celery, and a hint of thyme gave the pilaf a savory depth, while a dash of hot pepper added subtle heat. Served with cornbread or fried green tomatoes, it filled bellies and satisfied the craving for something both nourishing and steeped in tradition. This was a dinner that honored the resilience of generations who turned humble ingredients into lasting comfort. It carried the memory of fields and family gardens while fitting neatly into busy urban kitchens. Cowpeas and rice pilaf reminded everyone that simple foods, cooked with patience and love, could rival any fancy restaurant meal when shared around a welcoming table. Sorghum syrup bread was a wartime and Depression-era answer to expensive refined sugar. Sorghum, a tall grass grown widely in the South, was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that tasted earthy and sweet. Families would use it in place of sugar, mixing it into simple bread doughs to stretch rations and still enjoy something satisfying. Sorghum syrup bread was hearty, with a flavor that carried a touch of bitterness, but warmed the spirit. Children often slathered slices with butter or drippings, while adults enjoyed it with strong coffee. It was a farm food at its core, tied directly to the fields where sorghum stalks grew. Sorghum bread meant that no one had to give up sweetness completely, even when sugar prices were too high or stores ran out. This loaf was practical, easy to make at home, and deeply tied to southern soil. After times of scarcity passed, sorghum faded, but the memory of that dark bread stayed. Hog brains and eggs was once a breakfast staple in rural communities, valued for being inexpensive, high in protein, and deeply flavorful. The brains were cleaned, seasoned, and sautéed until tender, then folded into scrambled eggs for a creamy texture and rich taste, unlike anything else. This dish was often cooked in a cast-iron skillet, where the residual heat helped meld the flavors together. Served with biscuits or grits, it was a hearty start to the day for those working long hours in the fields or factories. In many African American households, it was both a practical and cultural dish, rooted in the tradition of using every part of the animal. Its preparation carried the knowledge of how to clean and cook ingredients that many today would pass over. Over time, changing tastes and supermarket offerings pushed hog brains out of everyday cooking, and with it went the skill to prepare them well. While it may seem unusual to modern diners, for those who grew up with it, hog brains and eggs were just breakfast, warm, filling, and made with care. Fried porgy with hot sauce carried the salt air of the Atlantic coast right into neighborhood kitchens and fish fries across the 1970s South and Northeast. Porgy, a small but flavorful ocean fish, was cleaned, scored, and dredged in a seasoned cornmeal mixture before sliding into hot peanut oil. The crackle of frying fish and the sharp scent of cayenne filled the air as golden fillets emerged crisp and steaming. A drizzle of homemade hot sauce or a squeeze of lemon brought just enough heat and brightness to balance the sweet, briny meat. Families served it with sliced white bread, coleslaw, or grits, letting the simple sides highlight the catch of the day. For many households, this was more than a meal. It was a reason for gathering, a chance to laugh and share stories while the fish came out of the pan in batches. Affordable and deeply satisfying, fried porgy celebrated coastal traditions and proved that fresh fish and a steady hand could create a dinner worthy of any weekend crowd. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Potlikker soup was more than just a humble broth. It was the essence of the greens it came from. When collards, turnip greens, or mustard greens simmered slowly with a bit of seasoning and maybe a ham bone, the cooking liquid would take on a deep, savory flavor and a rich, earthy aroma. Nothing in the kitchen went to waste, and that pot liquor was treasured for its nourishment, especially in leaner times. It was often sipped straight from a bowl or paired with cornbread, which was crumbled right into the broth to soak up every last drop. This soup carried vitamins, minerals, and memories of long afternoons spent around the table, talking as the pot bubbled on the stove. In African American kitchens, it was both medicine and comfort, believed to restore strength after illness or a hard day's work. The taste was unmistakable, salty, smoky, and green all at once, with each batch a little different depending on the greens and the cook. Today, store-bought greens rarely yield the same kind of rich cooking liquid, and many younger cooks have never tasted this kitchen staple. Yet for those who remember, pot liquor was a liquid linked to home. Cornmeal-crusted okra cakes turned a beloved southern vegetable into a crispy entree that delighted both adults and children during the 1970s. Fresh okra pods were sliced thin and mixed with cornmeal, minced onions, and a touch of buttermilk to create a thick batter. Small patties were formed by hand and pan, fried in hot oil until each cake developed a crunchy golden crust with a tender green interior. The nutty flavor of the cornmeal complemented the mild tang of the okra, while a sprinkle of salt right out of the pan sealed in the warmth. Served alongside sliced tomatoes or a dollop of hot sauce, these cakes were both hearty and refreshingly light. They made clever use of garden harvests when okra plants produced more pods than anyone could stew. Families prized the recipe as a thrifty way to transform vegetables into a main dish that felt indulgent. Each bite offered a satisfying crunch and a reminder that the simplest garden gifts could create meals worth remembering decades later. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Hoe cakes were a simple, satisfying food that came together from just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, fried crisp on a hot skillet, or even on a flat hoe blade over an open fire in earlier times. They carried a taste of history, rooted in resourcefulness and the ability to make something delicious from the bare essentials. The texture was hearty yet tender, with a slight crunch at the edges and a comforting warmth in the middle. Served plain or with a drizzle of syrup, they made for a meal that could be eaten at any time of the day. In many African American homes, hoe cakes were not just food, but a connection to family traditions passed quietly through generations. They were quick to make, filling enough to sustain a long day's work, and easy to prepare over whatever heat source was available. Today, they have nearly disappeared from daily kitchens, replaced by store-bought breads and processed mixes, but they still live on in the memories of those who grew up eating them hot from the skillet. Every bite was a reminder that good food did not need to be fancy to be special. Sweet potato biscuits with honey were a beloved comfort food that turned humble ingredients into something special. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in the South, cheap to grow, and full of natural sweetness. By mashing them into biscuit dough, families created soft, tender breads that did not require as much flour or fat. Fresh biscuits out of the oven were topped with a drizzle of local honey if it was available, making them feel indulgent despite their simplicity. These biscuits were often served for breakfast, but they could also accompany stews or fried fish. They filled stomachs and brought warmth to the table, offering both nutrition and comfort. Sweet potatoes symbolized resilience, and honey added a touch of hope in difficult times. Together, they created a dish that carried meaning well beyond its taste. Sweet potato biscuits with honey reflected the heart of soul food, making something beautiful and memorable from ingredients that were always within reach.
Those kitchens went quiet, and the recipes left with the hands that made them. Like and subscribe if you still remember the taste.